Welcome to the discussion Post-Pandemic Spatial Shift Urbanist View of Life After COVID-19. As 95% corona cases are in urban areas across the world, it is pertinent to understand whether the structure of cities play any role in spreading or containing the disease. It will be interesting to understand the impacts of COVID-19 on cities and what kind of recovery plan will be required for the cities and spaces. Almost whole world is under lockdown, hopefully in fag end. We feel as if we are in some dystopian world, but there are some positive signs that this unknown, unpredictable disease might be controlled, and leaders across the globe are discussing the plans to reopen the life and economy. However, there is a valid concern. Like any other contagions, these contagions will also be cyclic in nature, and we will have to take precautions till the vaccination for COVID-19 is available and widespread. Right now, we are responding to the disaster with emergency measures, but in near future, social distancing will remain the norm at least for next couple of years. Lots of research is happening on disaster preparedness and response, and most importantly, about the places we live in. It's my pleasure to welcome well-known urban researchers Dr. Alexander Jachnow and architect Sulakshana Mahajan to this discussion. Welcome, ma'am. Welcome, Alex. How are you?
Hello, how are you? I'm good, how are you?
Dr. Jachnow is Head of Urban Strategies and Planning at Institute for Housing Studies and Urban Development of Erasmus University, Rotterdam. At IHS, he teaches urban planning and development, including policy framework and national urban policies. He is engaged in various advisory and research assignments with various multilateral organizations. He is also working as consultant for preparing disaster management framework for Kerala government. Welcome, Alex. Sulakshana Mahajan is senior urban planner and researcher. She did her architecture from JJ School of Architecture, Mumbai. She has worked extensively at public and private sector institutions. She has worked as consultant urban planner at Mumbai Transformation Support Unit or MTSU. She has carried out research on housing, transport, planning and governance. She is column writer in newspapers and she has authored various books on urban planning in Marathi. Welcome, ma'am. First, let us understand some frequently used words today. Risk and disaster, vulnerability and resilience, preparedness and response, mitigation and adaptation, also Sendai framework. So I request Dr. Alex to explain these terms in brief.
That is already a very broad comments, but let me try. I think first of all, what we need to understand, especially in the situation of the pandemic, is that the exposure to risk is the biggest variation. So risk can be anything, and risk or disaster can happen everywhere. But what I was pointing out is if we talk about the level of risks or disasters, we have to always consider what kind of vulnerabilities, what kind of exposure different people, different systems have towards the risk. So in view on face of the this pandemic, it is clear that cities are much more vulnerable because the populations in cities are much more interacting and the virus can travel very fast. So the possibility of looking into resilience, which would be the other term, is actually how to increase the level of resistance to being vulnerable. And this is very difficult in this situation because there is no way to protect us against the virus other than not having interactions, which is the core of an urban of an urban life. The resilience describes the level of your way to protect yourself against risk and to lower your vulnerability. So they are all interlinked. the less protected, the less resilient you are, the more affected you will be by any kind of risk and disaster. So there is an unequal exposure towards risk within people, within human society, because people are differently vulnerable. At the moment, elder people are more vulnerable for the coronavirus, while, for example, in a vulnerability setting, in informal settlements, people that have access to the most polluted water are the most vulnerable to waterborne diseases, etc. So there is a difference in each and every person in terms of vulnerability, while risk and disaster is actually more or less all the same, so to say. So if you think about the tsunami, the kind of disaster has equal effects on different coasts, but it had very different impacts on different coasts, depending on their disaster preparedness.
I request Dr. Alex to explain mitigation and adaptation.
Again, this is very high depending on what kind of mitigation adaptation we're talking about. In general, for example, talking about climate change mitigation would be that we mitigate the negative impacts of climate change by, for example, reducing carbon dioxide. But nowadays we see more possibilities to link mitigation and adaptation. Adaptation would be just to build, for example, higher dams, to have more flood-prone areas, to be more prepared for disasters. That would be the adaptation part of it. And mitigation would be to reduce the kind of disasters. But it's often both in the same, or in many urban projects, both adaptation and mitigation should be taken into account, because they can be very easily combined. For example, a mangrove forest would protect a coastal area, and at the same time it would also mitigate the effects, because mangrove forests are very important ecosystem services that also provide resilience, that enhance the possibility of the coast to react to disaster, etc. So both of them play, adaptation and mitigation play an important role together, not only separately.
Also Sendai framework.
Of course, it's not binding. It's not a UN resolution, which means it is an agreement of good intentions, and therefore very differently perceived by different member states of the UN, which are most of the nations in the world. So it is a bit up to the interpretation of the nation state how to and what to implement from the Sendai framework. I think the interesting part of the Sendai is really that you have all three levels of risk and adaptation and resilience. So that is in terms of social, of economic, and environmental, because we often have the understanding that if we talk about sustainability or about resilience, we talk about the environment, but we can also, of course, talk about social resilience or economic resilience. And again, to talk about this very specific time that we are in with the coronavirus, the economic resilience is one of the things I think we haven't taken sufficiently care of, because now we are in a very strong economic crisis, because we had a few assumptions that, for example, globalization will be working well, that we have an interchange of goods, that production globally will not come to a halt. And now we have a situation where Europe, highly dependent from imports from India, from China, is looking into a shortage of provision of goods, and our economic resilience is not very strong. Though we might be economically very strong in Europe, we have not built enough economic resilience to really bounce back. We might survive because we have the resources, like economically, our economies will survive. They will not be harmed significantly. But that is just because we can rebuild them with the on the grounds, on the basis that we have already installed before, but not because we have a very resilient economic systems. Our economic systems are very vulnerable because we are very dependent on the global development, on globalization, on global exchange.
Thank you so much, Alex. Humanity has faced many disasters and pandemic in the past. Last year, Kerala was devastated by floods. In 2005, it was Mumbai. We keep on encountering with natural and man-made disaster time and again. But this is a biological pandemic. World and India has faced biological pandemics too in the past, like cholera outbreaks, Spanish flu, plagues before independence, etc. There was plague outbreak in Surat in 90s too. TB is still prevalent in India with high mortality rate. Then there were Ebola, swine flu, Zika, Nipah. Okay, so how different are biological pandemics from natural or man-made disasters? How we respond to them?
Disaster risk management, that you have to be very specific about what kind of disaster, what kind of risk you have to deal with. And you have to adopt, of course, all your measures towards the risk that you face. Just for talking about Kerala and the disaster that is happening there, the disasters that were happening in 2018-19, the biggest threats and the biggest disasters that happened was actually landslides and flooding. So there is a very strong difference between the two, because in landslides you have a very fatal immediate disaster impact, while in flooding you have you can bounce back to flooding because flooding comes slower than landslides. Or to be very drastic about it, flooding starts, maybe you see that coming. If you have a house next to the channel or next to a water body, you will see the water rising, so you can take out all the valuables of your house, you can secure your house, you can take your family away, etc. So you can react to flooding. While in the situation of a landslide, landslides are very fatal because they happen in very short times. They can happen within 20-30 minutes. You have a whole Earth's lavine, how you say that, an avalanche, like a mud avalanche coming down and destroying houses and the people living in there, killing it. That requires very different measures of disaster risk preparedness. You cannot talk about disaster risk preparedness of flooding and landslides at the same time. You have to have completely different sets of disaster risk and disaster management. And it's the same with pandemics. If you have a vaccination, I think it's easy to control a virus. If you don't have it, it's very hard to control. If you don't know how it spreads, or it spreads, or it spreads very quickly, then your measures are very limited. And isolation is the only response the world is thinking of now. So there is also a lot of discussion if this is really the best response, because we can't live in isolation for the rest of our lives and not interact anymore. But we cannot just go out and say, okay, let's then interact, and whoever dies will die, because we have to find something in between the two options.
May I ask a question to Alex? I think this pandemic is much different as far as the other disasters are concerned. Especially, I think, isn't it a big failure of communicating the real threat, the real possibility of this pandemic? Do you think that effective communication, early warnings, early signs could have been could have reduced this impact on economy as well as health of people if China had really given a lot of information and communicated in a transparent way and given time for preparation to countries for this kind of a pandemic?
Yeah, definitely communication would have helped, but it's always difficult to say afterwards what was the biggest mistake in the past, because in the SARS situation, the SARS epidemic, actually it did not spread as much as it was expected. And then actually China was more warning about it, and we were more aware of the SARS virus before it started spreading. Now with Corona, it's the other way around. We've seen it all on the news. We saw Wuhan being locked down. We heard how China is in a tremendous distress. But nobody would have expected that it will also affect the rest of Asia and Europe and US America and Latin America and now Africa. So this is something I say.
I think next, we hope there shouldn't be any such big threat, but in case there is a likelihood of spread of any disease or such biological disaster, likelihood of a disaster, I think people would rather believe after this disaster that even if they may not 100% be sure of the impact, but I think they will be more careful in responding compared to this kind of a pandemic.
Definitely. Yes, definitely.
Okay, coming back to my next question. Pandemics change the course of planning and architecture, especially in Western world. According to urban thinkers, this pandemic too will have profound impact on neighborhoods, cities, and all our spaces. There is a counter view too, as solution of this pandemic is expected to be available in short span of time. COVID-19 is unlikely to change our urbanization and cities dramatically. The changes will be more subtle and directed towards more sustainable urban future, focusing on housing, material, transportation, cooperation and network of cities, urbanization in developing world, etc. So, I want to ask, ma'am, so how far the impact of COVID-19 will be on our cities, whether it will be subtle or profound?
Yeah.
You too.
To clarify, of course, I'm not a virologist, and I would not know how frequent this kind of disaster would repeat itself. However, what I heard is that there could be more types of viruses for which we then again would need vaccination, which we then again have to have a lockdown for, etc. And that is because there is a lot of mutation of viruses that have been previously in somewhere very hidden in the nature, in the jungles, in animals and wild animals. Also, the Ebola virus is supposed to come from wild animals. The coronavirus is supposed to come from bats. So as we are, as humans, too much interacting lately with this protected wildlife or this faraway wildlife, there is a higher chance that there will be more viruses. So if this is an assumption that has its scientific base, then we have to assume that we have to build our cities differently. Because that would mean if we have in whatever, in 5 or 10 years, another virus like the coronavirus, we will definitely have to have learned our lessons and we have to be better prepared. And that means that we have to plan our spaces differently, that we have to think about all the whatever concerns architecture, planning, space design, urban design, that you have this 1.5 meters between people, that you have less interaction, that you have less contact, physical contact, that you can, of course, build with urban design and architectural design. You can think about new ways of building supermarkets where people cannot walk an aisle at 2 persons at the same time. You can think about office blocks where people are not sitting all together in one big office, which is actually now the 21st century design of many offices. We would go back to have like more cubicle-like offices, more sheltered spaces, etc. So I assume that yes, this will have an impact, and that architects and urban planners will have to think of doing it differently. Because I mean, then again, you have cultural differences. I imagine it very difficult to implement a 1.5 meters distance in urban design in Mumbai. Or just think about the trains in Mumbai or the markets. So it would be very, very difficult to think about solutions there other than just limiting the amount of people going there. And then if you start limiting, then it might even have an impact on the growth of cities, because these multi-million cities, they work very efficiently because they allow a lot of people in very narrow spaces. And if you think about the risks that brings, then we also have to think about how to solve this risk by having less people in an urban area together.
Less people in the urban areas. Anyway, thank you so much, Alex. Before discussing the post pandemic scenario, let us understand the role of cities in spreading or containing the pandemic. As mentioned earlier, 95% corona cases are in urban areas. The quintessential factor of cities, density, mobility, health infrastructure and hygiene, quality of services, local governance, global integration are playing role in spread of pandemic. Density and public transport especially are much maligned and vilified in spread of pandemic. How each of these factors is impacting the disease spread? Sulakshana ma'am, are mega regions and cities more vulnerable to COVID-19 than rural areas? Do you see any relationship between urban form and coronavirus spread?
Extremely crowded, high density living is there, and at every place, including open spaces, you see crowds of people, and there is hardly any space around you because you are almost touching a person. So having a social distancing norm is almost impossible in cities like Mumbai. We are facing what has happened is that people have come to trust on the more on medicine and medical services, and in Mumbai especially we have neglected the urban planning and architectural issues, where how to avoid crowding in houses. We still find in Mumbai there are 10 people living in 250 square feet house, and there is hardly any space, there is hardly any ventilation, and we don't call it pandemic, but there is huge number of TB cases in such settlements, and these are not informal, these are formal settlements, multi-storied building constructed as public housing. And we were really worried last 2-3 years that this is something which has to be avoided by public authorities. However, all the time for last 3 or 4 years, when we were saying that our densities are killing, we should work with lesser densities. Everyone was laughing at us, architects. All architects also surprisingly said, "No, densities don't matter. If we have high rises and we have more space per person, the densities won't matter." But because people come down even from high rises, people go for shopping, they come down, they travel in the lifts, multi-storied buildings. And how can you avoid crowding in semi-public or public spaces, even if you have private space in the houses? Not that our poor people can't even afford that. But I think once for all, this pandemic will settle this argument, which was always thrown at us that densities don't matter. But now I think something will be sure that densities do matter, and we should not work with very, very high densities and should not allow high densities to be constructed in Mumbai, because sometimes they have gone to almost 900 houses per hectare, which is nowhere to be found, not even in Hong Kong. So I think Mumbai will change its attitude. Mumbai will change its understanding about density. It will also change its attitude towards poor people and their housing needs. So, even though we find medicines and all this, I think in places like Mumbai and other cities in India, we as architects and planners still have to work very, very hard to convince our authorities, our people that yes, too much of density is not good for anyone, not even for poor, not even for the rich people, because pandemic like this doesn't protect even the rich people from getting affected. So I think that is what I think will change in Mumbai. I hope it will change.
Thanks, ma'am. So I can understand two terms you are using with respect to density. One is the crowding, and other is the per capita built up space.
Already have very less open space per person. We have less than square meter per person of open space in Mumbai, and where poor people stay, they hardly have any open space. Not even between the building, not even outside the building, not even around the building, and but they don't have playground. They don't have places to go and sit under the tree or anywhere. So it's high density as well as crowding in whatever little public spaces we have. So we have to address both the issues in Mumbai.
So thus urban form plays critical role according to you, right?
Yes, urban form, it does play. Yeah, Alex, go on. Alex, want to say something about
No, no,
this?
I'm good. I'm listening.
Yeah, urban forms depend on the lot of parameters like land cost and the distance to work, the type of employment generated in cities. Like Pune is so much different than Mumbai, which is a linear city, very crowded, on a historically on a very small amount of land it has been constructed, and it's getting more and more economic activities, and especially it has tried to stop people from coming, but it never has been successful because of many reasons. I think we never understood urban processes, we never understood urban planning. It was largely the ignorance of our planners and policymakers as far as urban planning was concerned. And only I see in last 2 decades there is some understanding coming to the field in the field of urban planning and architecture. But still, I find architects are not really convinced that urban densities, urban planning norms are important. They still feel that only per capita built up space is just what they are looking for, which is not correct, and they are overlooking most of the other things, which is not right. So, as far as urban forms are seen, and we look at the sustainability, then public transport is a must. But public transport in case of Mumbai can become a detriment factor, but then we can't avoid it. So how do we transform our public transport to have less density and more efficiency and still good speed? So I think we will have to think of not only form, but we will have to think of innovative ways of public transportation and design of public transport, because we have limited space for private transport. That we must understand. In Mumbai or most of the country, we can't afford cars, and even if we afford cars, there is no space for cars. Except in Delhi, also that you feel there is space, but if everyone starts traveling by cars, there is hardly any space. So we will have to rethink about the spatial planning of job and housing together, traveling distances from house to many other services. It has to be managed within a short distance and not traveling for hours together or hundreds of kilometers per day, because in Mumbai people do travel at least 40-50 kilometers one way, and they spend 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening, and sometimes they are stuck in the public transport. So somehow whole of our planning has to be completely revamped, rethought of, sadly, we don't have planners who can think of this. We still don't have researchers who can look into this. Uh, Somehow we have overlooked, and I think this is one of the areas where we have a lot of uh, ground to be covered next few years. We have many challenges than people really perceive, because people think that architects think that they are urban planners, but they can't think beyond a building envelope. But urban planning and urban design is much larger and more complex issues are there involved. And that's why we say that urban planning and architecture are two different kinds of professions. And please don't equate them, and don't trust architects as planners, or don't trust planners as architects, because these are two totally different professions, which is still not understood by our government. And they think that architects are planners, but it's a wrong notion. And planning, everyone thinks that yes, we can plan, and they see something in the Western country like skywalks. Okay, let's bring skywalks. But they don't see that people can't climb on the skybox, and skybox are empty. We have spent so much of money on that, but we didn't spend money on improvement of public transport, or in efficiency or capacity of public. So many wrong decisions and priorities were not decided by planners, but by the political pressures of different groups, and different at different times. So basically, not having your own mind and your own understanding of planning, lack of understanding of your issues of your particular city is one of the main roadblock in the whole urban planning, urban progress in India. And I don't know how that challenge we are going to face, but somehow we have to train large number of younger people into thinking of urban problems and cities, how we can be.
Thank you so much, Sulakshana ma'am. In the past, it was speculated that globalization and advancement in transportation will reduce importance of geographies and cities. However, we experience strengthening of agglomeration and instead importance of cities increased. Now, this pandemic is changing the way we live. Remote working, distant learning, home deliveries instead of restaurant dining, etc. will be the norm in future. Cities are places of economic agglomeration and innovation. Will this pandemic separate activities from spaces? Will this pandemic reduce the importance of cities which globalization couldn't so far? Will there be a reverse migration towards villages and smaller urban area will be the future of urbanization?
To all of us. I mean, first of all, what you're saying is correct, that we and I also long before the pandemic, I think it was in the discussion that many people, among them me, we understood city not as a necessity to be, but as a wish to be. In other words, people do choose an urban lifestyle because they want to. It's not out of the necessity or the functional or like the logistic of participating in economic or social activities. It is because we are social animals. We want to be in cities. We want to interact. We want to be exposed to others. So that's why cities and being in big human settlements, to put it that way, has always been attractive to humans. I think there is very few humans in the world that would actually prefer to be completely isolated or living in a very small, reduced community. That has been for thousands of years the main way of living, but it was not the preferred way. And I'm not promoting city life over rural life. I'm just saying that people prefer to have these exposures, to have these possibilities, these opportunities of interaction, of being with other people, of having other opportunities. So that is only given by a city. Now, the question, of course, is, does IT technology fully replace this? And we don't know, because we haven't lived that. And if I look at my young sons, they are 17 and 19, they do actually find, to my understanding, a lot of satisfaction by talking just over phone and WhatsApp and Skype with their friends. They don't need to meet them. And that you also see in public spaces, for example, that when I was young, we were hanging out in public spaces. We were sitting on the benches and just to meet and talk. And you hardly see this anymore. This is not what, and that was before the pandemic already, that young people would stay at home and chat over Skype, or they would use IT, any kind of IT device. So maybe humans can actually replace physical interaction with IT technology interaction. If this is happening, then we do have the flat city, or the flat human settlement, because then everybody could live everywhere. But it's not wise from any point of view. It's not a good idea to have like a complete sprawl everywhere, because we still need water, we need electricity, we need connection, we need transport systems. So it is a good idea to live close to each other. But Sulakshana was already discussing the density, and of course density is a problem if you have too much density of it, and also if you have too less. So you have to find an ideal balance of densities. And that is very, very difficult to find. And it is not defined by what is good in kind of densities, but it is actually only defined by the land value, by the culture, by many other things, but not necessarily by people like urban designers sitting together and saying, okay, this is the kind of density we would allow. Because if you allow it in a zoning, in a master plan, people will go below or go above and then change the law, etc. So it's very difficult to say, okay, this is the ideal density. And another thought, sorry, yes, ask.
Yeah, please continue.
Yeah, please.
No, I had another thought triggered by what Sulakshana was saying. There was the economic need to work from to work with a growing population. Families were bound to the family economies, so we all grew our families in order to have social protection and social security. That is why humans, no matter if in a monogamic or polygamic society, they would have more children than they are themselves. So for thousands of years, no matter if Europe, India, Africa, people would have 5, 6 children, and of those, maybe 2 or 3 would reach adulthood and reach an old age. So there was a stable population, but always an overpopulation in terms of reproduction. And that was economically important, because you cannot have less children than you have adult populations, because then your economy would break. And that is no matter if you talk about a community or a family or even a city. So we were programmed to overpopulate. Now with medical advance, and then also that has to do again with the pandemic, because now I think what I see is nature is also trying to limit a bit the number of humans. We are now 7.5 billion people living on the globe. So I think that nature is really saying, okay, let's cut a bit of this overpopulation, because it's not good for the world. So in new terms, we will have economies that will only work if we have reduced populations. The people that grow less, or the societies that grow less, the societies that have much more control about their family planning, will overcome this kind of economic and social crisis much easier than those societies that are growing in population very fast.
Yeah.
So it's a big disadvantage at the moment to have an economic population. To have a population growth. It's a big disadvantage economically, socially, in terms of densities, in terms of use of space, in terms of land. Land
Yes.
values, access to land, access to housing. If you have a growing population, it's not good. I'm not saying that we should all now start and reduce our family sizes, but in the long run, I think this is the one economic trigger that we have to look into the global population and its growth. If we don't get a control of this, then everything else not really important anymore.
But do you think this kind of imbalance among the developed world, having more aged people and countries like India where more young people are there and all the growing population is there, will there be some kind of adjustment through migration? Because right now migration
Yes.
has been limited by by borders and countries and all that. In many places like Singapore, they do get Filipinos to service their houses and
Yeah.
nurses from different countries. Even in India, we send many nurses to Middle East and for economic reasons as well as for because we have surplus population. So that surplus young population, if they are trained, will there be a new trend in migration of either temporary migration for economic reasons,
Yes.
for
Yeah.
servicing your
As you are
advanced?
saying, it is happening already. It's not a future phenomenon. It is already happening. There
Okay.
is a lot of young populations migrating, and
Yeah,
there's a
but
lot of global mobility. And I don't think that the corona will stop this.
there is feeling, anti-feeling people. On the other hand, like in US, though migration is not happening to a large scale, what happened earlier, there is a huge backlash against migration, which is again
Yeah.
not really supported by data or anything. So maybe we have to have better communication about the impacts of migration on different economies.
Alex,
What will happen to the places of congregation like stadia, transport stations, theatres, art galleries, schools, public spaces? Will the scaling down of these places increase the inequalities by making places unaffordable to poor? I mean, take an example of a stadium of 50,000 capacity. If you scale it down to 10,000 capacity, cost of the tickets will increase, and obviously it will restrict the access to these events. Will there be a new financial model for all these congregation areas? How social distancing will impact the transportation and mobility in the cities, especially in city like Mumbai, where there are nearly 5 million people travel daily in overcrowded local railway. Will people abandon? Will people abandon or at last avoid public transport to rely on private cars? Will it negatively impact the vision of green mobility to fight climate change? There are many questions.
Yeah, I mean that's a correct statement. I don't think it's really a question. We will have a situation where spaces will be revalued, and you might have the bad effect that actually spaces will be more privatized, more exclusive, more reserved to a few, literally to a few, but then of course with an oligarchic taste to it, because the people that have the most money or the influence or the resources, they will benefit the most from reduced access to space. We always, like, access was always one of the biggest concerns when we talked about urban poverty, not so much about being deprived from food or being deprived from economic income. That is not the major issue in urban poverty. The major issue in urban poverty is the deprivation from access. The limit you have for accessing services, the limit you have, for example, to access education, to access hospitals, etc. Also, just for the mere distance to it, the peripheral informal settlements, etc., that did not have access. So imagine if that could be really a very dark that we have to block ourselves more and more away from each other. What that means in terms of poor and rich, because then the rich will build their walls even higher and they will restrict people to come into their spaces even more. So that definitely has a very bad taste to it.
Thank you so much, Alex. There are organizations and urbanists researching on impact of COVID-19 on cities, like Council of Architecture India, UN Habitat, City Lab, Research Florida, and some more. I have compiled some specific spatial interventions suggested by them in a chart. I'll summarize here. UN Habitat's response plan focuses on policy, institutional framework, capacity building of local governments and communities, especially slums. Specific measures include providing hand washing and sanitation facilities to slums, mobile medical facilities, and temporary shelters for social distancing. Almost all are talking about urban tech, personal safety gears like masks, PPEs, access to hand washing, access control and scanning, space dividers, retrofitting of spaces, etc. Also, most of them think that scaling down the footfall in congregation spaces, public transport, aeroplanes is inevitable. City Lab and other urbanists insist on opening the streets to the people, increasing widths of sidewalks, bike-friendly cities, more open spaces, in short, green cities. Also, some are predicting changes in house plan, like providing the hand washing facilities and bathroom near entrance and bringing back the vestibule. But COA's suggestion of scaling down the occupant load for building and vehicles. COA suggests scaling down the occupant's load for buildings and vehicles. Also, COA advises to avoid public transport. How it is possible, especially in megacities like Mumbai, Delhi and New York? How we are going to avoid public transport? Also, how far these changes and interventions will be possible for India? As a recovery plan, which intervention in special planning and policy should be immediate, intermediate and long term? What do you think?
No, that's what I think, that architects don't understand planning and public transport and cities. That is why I say that architects really don't understand the need for public transport, wider footpaths and all that, and they think the private transport is the answer to everything. That is one of the fallacies of, I think Council of Architecture is absolutely wrong in saying, because it is, I think it is headed by very elite people. They don't understand the ground reality. And why can't they think of improving public transport in different manners? By improving capacity, improving efficiency, improving hygienic conditions within public transport, and not supporting public transport is absolutely wrong way. Again, they are not thinking in terms of promoting wider footpaths for people to walk. They are always supporting the curtailing of footpaths and increasing the lanes for private transport. So I think Council of Architecture and has to be uh, has to talk to urban planners on the issues which they are not concerned with. Architecture is not concerned with real cities. They are concerned with only their plans and their buildings, and they're happy to show private cars and big cars in front of their architectural fantasies. And that's not the way cities work. Cities work on a very large scale. So I don't support. I saw the table, I saw the responses, and I think it needs to be really, the architects need to be educated on the issues of planning. So there is a huge difference between what people from City Lab are proposing and Council of Architects is proposing. So you can see the difference in approaches of these two institutions.
The implementation of the ideas is, I mean, in the complexity of a city, you can implement all of them at the same time, or you can see the conflicting rationalities that there are. It's very much about the shape of the cities that we are, or the dynamics that have created the cities. So in the cities that we are living in at the moment, they are also very diverse and very complex, and they offer different ways of interactions, of services. There is different, so to say, there is even different tribes, so to say, in a city with very different approaches to the city. You have commuters that walk to work. You have people that go by their own car. You have people that use public transport of all kinds, or private public transports. So there is a milliard of combinations possible to live your urban life, and that's also the beauty of it, because you have this huge diversity. So all these city labs and the proposals that are talking about how the ideal city should look like, or UN Habitat promoting the compact city, etc. They are all there. It's just not the one and only way to do cities. So we do have the possibility to do many different cities in one urban space, and this also will not change, I believe. So we should rather understand the diversity of cities instead of trying to streamline them and having them all in the same way. And I fully agree with Sulakshana's observation regarding that architects often they look at the very physical structure of cities. They don't understand all the flows and the interactions and the need of dynamics in a city. And of course, you have to think about transport if you think about buildings, but many people don't. They just put the buildings wherever it suits them or wherever they can access to land. But they don't think of the system of the city.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thanks, ma'am. But any specific intervention?
I don't know, can you hear me? Somehow my window is gone.
Yes.
You can hear me.
I can see you, I can hear you.
Oh, I thought somehow it's two, three things are there. I think this pandemic is going to have a very different impact on India. Right now, we are not seeing the numbers rising as high as America, even though we have huge population. Even compared to New York, Mumbai numbers are quite modest. So I'm wondering why we are not seeing the same impact of pandemic on city like Mumbai, which I expected to be much higher, or maybe I was wrong. But there seems to be different factors which we probably will explore much later. But one thing is for sure that this pandemic has shaken our cities like nowhere, not earlier times. I haven't seen. We had one disaster on 5th July in 2005 or 26th July. Huge floods happened. Many people lost their lives within few hours. And we hope that the city will learn from those disasters, but it has not learned anything from those disasters in last 15 years, and it has been the business as usual. But I hope this is a very different pandemic, and for the first time, I've mentioned in one of my articles that the political elements which used to be vehemently opposing migrants from other parts of India are now urging them, please don't leave Mumbai, we will take care of you, please don't go out of Mumbai, because the spread of pandemic, it reaches in the villages, I think it will be greater disaster. So somehow people have changed their mindset within a very short time. The political mindset happens. This is I'm seeing for the first time for last 40 years. Years, some people who were opposing migration are not saying. And one of the TV channels asked me now if all the migrants leave the city like Mumbai, how will Mumbai survive? I said, I'm not worried about how Mumbai will survive, but all these people leaving city and maybe carrying the pathogens with them into hundreds and thousands of villages, what will happen to the villages? And the communities in villages, because we have seen during the AIDS epidemic, people migrated back to their homes in different villages in different states, and huge numbers were killed. They carried the AIDS virus and to their families, and huge numbers of families were really destroyed in the rural areas. And that time, no one really told these people that please don't leave Mumbai, you will get treatment. People simply left, and the whole AIDS spread across the country, and people were killed, children were affected, women were affected very, very badly. So I think this pandemic is much different, and it's happening in a very short period of time. It has impacted the cities the most. The most vulnerable cities are in Maharashtra, and Maharashtra is one of the most progressive states. So I think it will, instead of looking at the historical mistakes, it will start looking at the future in a very positive way. And I really hope this has taught us a lesson, and many things in which we were trying to convince the government for last few years that please don't allow too much of density, please don't allow the kind of vertical slums you are creating. But we were not taken seriously. But I hope after this, and people are already talking, yes, that yes, what you are saying is right. But at least I hope this pandemic will change much more in India than in New York. I was thinking of New York. I don't think public transport will be replaced by private transport in New York. They will come up with solutions of different kinds of how to clean air, how to have self-cleaning materials so that the virus doesn't spread through touching, and also social distancing norms could be followed with help of many more agents. I mean, a lot of action will be taken in a different fashion. One can't imagine, but I think New York will never decline. I don't see the pandemic will affect in that fashion. But New York will always come up with solutions which will help it to maintain its status. Similarly, most of the I don't know they will take care of their poor people. I think the minorities have been affected very adversely in America. So once the data is available, whatever is available, one can see that the pandemic has affected differently different communities, and they will start taking serious care of their poor people and people who have been not left behind in the development. So I think thinking will be much more diverse. Not it will not converge on matters of urban planning, but it will be more diverse thinking, and each city, each country will start thinking in its own term, and they will start sharing their knowledge, their understanding, their data more transparently. I hope really, and overall, the world will. I don't think globalization, for the short, it is affected, but global exchanges of ideas, of knowledge, of medicine, of human survival, and many sustainable issues. I think they will spread much more deeply throughout the world, and that's my hope. This pandemic is, on the other side, is teaching us a lot of new lessons which we couldn't have learned on the other in any other way.
Allow me to support the idea of Sulakshana, because I also would say that we are not very able to learn from disasters. I worked, for example, in Nepal in 2015 after the earthquake, and it was called Bouncing Back Better. So the idea was to take the possibility, the opportunity of the earthquake to rebuild, for example, Bhaktapur in more resilient ways. But that did not happen. It happened the opposite. People built very quickly, very unsustainable houses, often a floor more than they had before, in not earthquake resilient architecture. So they got more vulnerable than they've been before. So they had the immediate, they had the experience, the personal, very strong experience of having survived an earthquake and still not learning the lesson of building better houses afterwards. So because they were saying, like, the next earthquake will happen in 100 years, so we don't care. So this is our capacity to learn and to do things better in future is, as humans, unfortunately very, very limited. We are not very good at learning. We are, especially not if it would require a mind change or a really significant change of how we do things. So that also then responds to your question a bit. I think that we could, of course, draw some lessons. There is not so many very obvious lessons. Of course, social distancing is something that we have to factor into our ideas of urban design, of architecture, etc. But there have been, maybe we will establish some norms. So if there are some norms, then architects will follow the norms, and we will have spaces where the automatic, like the design distance between people is 1.5 meters, which will be then more costly. That will be then having impacts on the whole the whole economy of space. So maybe also not so much desired. Maybe it would be better to think about other ways of reacting to the next pandemic by having people being more, I don't know, more aware of it or doing other things. Then again, I talked about vulnerability in the beginning. I think it's very important to understand that our vulnerability towards this kind of virus is very different. We know that young people, children, etc., they might carry the virus, but they are not dying of it, mainly. So we could also think about having approaches like the Swedish are doing, having approaches where we say, okay, we are protecting the vulnerable population, but not all of the population, by isolating them. So that again would translate in other ways of building cities, or to have maybe different corridors, different interactions where people would move. That could also be interesting. Like we could have maybe transport systems where we don't mix people, which would be also very bizarre, but it could be maybe a response. That we have buses that are only for the elderly and buses that are only for the school children exclusively. I don't know, but as a disaster response, I think from a spatial design point of view, there is not so much that we can do. But I'm also hopeful that we have learned with coronavirus, we have learned that we are a global community. And globalization cannot be reversed, and we have more interactions. And then also, even this nice chat with you now, you are sitting in India, I'm sitting in Rotterdam, and we talk as if we were sitting at the same table together. And this kind of exchange, I think that will also increase, and it will spread. And then we have a better exchange of ideas, and we have a better way to also discuss things. And then we might come up with more globally relevant solutions to our global challenges, and that would be actually very nice. Yeah. So I would also like to close with this hopeful outlook that we will learn something. and we will
We will
hopefully
learn
put
few
it into practice.
lessons, not but maybe few lessons we will take home. Yes.
So that is great discussion, and you have given so much information about everything. Thank you so much, Alex. Thanks, ma'am. Your concluding comments about future urban policy, please. Also, please suggest what kind of studies should be taken up by urban researchers and students in relationship with COVID-19 and cities.
I don't know. I have to think through it. What topic? Maybe they can think of retrofitting few of the chawls for better hygienic conditions for the residents. That could be one of the topics for students in Mumbai, how to retrofit instead of pulling down and constructing those horrible buildings, what they can do with retrofitting the existing structures and include some hygienic features and create better conditions for people to live with. So these some kinds of these problems would be more interesting to look at than just creating new architectural facilities for say hospitals or all that. That we will anyway create. Let's concentrate on housing.
Interesting to look into this isolation pattern, that it should work with any kind of community, because now for many countries, like the industrialized countries in Europe, etc., it's a lockdown means you're sitting with your family of 2, 3, 4 members maybe in a house, while in many other countries, and especially also in India and Mumbai, you have as Sulakshana was mentioning, you have 10, 15 people living in one household. So there would be other kinds of community clustering. So
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting challenge for an architect to think about, how do you organize a lockdown with different sizes of communities, as maybe a mathematical, but then also as a design exercise.
Right,
To
that's a
think,
good
okay,
idea.
these people are not supposed to mix at the moment. So how do you separate them? Where can you arrange architecture that people are separated from each other but can still communicate, etc.?
Right. I think that's a good topic.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thanks, ma'am. Hoping to have more such sessions with you. See you.
Yes, pleasure was mine.